3 seconds. That was all it took for my dignity to be destroyed on the 42nd floor of the Vertex Tower. I was on my knees. My hands were soaked in dirty mop water. Above me stood Chadwick Sterling. He was the new vice president of operations. He was wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than my salary for 3 years. He looked down at me with eyes as cold as ice. He did not see a human being. He saw a stain. He saw a bug that needed to be crushed. The conference room was filled with 6 important investors from New York. They were sitting in leather chairs worth $5,000 each. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fear. Chadwick held his lukewarm latte in his manicured hand. He looked at the investors, and then he looked at me. He smiled a cruel, thin smile. Then he tipped the cup. Brown liquid splashed onto the pristine white carpet. It splashed onto my worn-out sneakers. It splashed onto my hands. The room went deadly silent. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up at him. Chadwick did not apologize. He turned to the investors and laughed softly. He said that this was exactly the problem with the company. He said that Vertex Innovations was full of incompetence from the bottom up. He pointed a shiny leather shoe at my face. He told me to clean it up. He actually told me to use my sleeve. He told the investors that the only way to fix this company was to cut the fat. He said we needed to eliminate human error. He looked me dead in the eye. He told me I was fired. He told me to get my trash and get out of his building before he called security to drag me out. The investors chuckled nervously. They thought it was a display of power. They thought Chadwick was a strong leader making tough decisions. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. I wanted to tell him that the building he was standing in did not belong to the board of directors. I wanted to tell him that his 6-figure salary was paid from an account that I controlled. But I said nothing. I bit my lip until I tasted iron. I grabbed my bucket. I stood up. My knees cracked. I lowered my head like a beaten dog. I walked out of the glass doors as Chadwick's laughter followed me down the hallway. He thought he had won. He thought he had just crushed a meaningless cleaner named Elena. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that he had just declared war on the owner of the shadowed holding company that was about to acquire Vertex Innovations. He didn't know that the woman in the blue jumpsuit was actually Elena Vance. And Elena Vance does not get fired. Elena Vance gets even. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the parking garage. My hands were still shaking from the rage. I took a deep breath. I pulled a burner phone from my pocket. It was not the cheap Android phone I used for my cover. It was a satellite phone with encrypted security. I dialed a number that only 3 people in the world knew. A voice answered on the first ring. The voice was deep and professional. It was Silas. He was my personal attorney and the executor of my father's estate. He asked me if the inspection was over. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. I wiped a smudge of dirt from my cheek. I told him that the inspection was finished. I told him to initiate Protocol 0. I told him to freeze all assets of the Vertex acquisition deal immediately. Chadwick wanted to play God. He wanted to treat people like garbage. Well, he was about to find out what happens when the garbage decides to take out the trash. The elevator dinged. I stepped out into the shadows of the garage. The game had just begun. I walked to the darkest corner of the parking garage. I stopped in front of a dirty gray sedan. It looked like a car that belonged to a woman who scrubbed floors for minimum wage. There was rust on the bumper. There was a dent in the side door. But appearances are deceptive. I placed my hand on the door handle. A hidden scanner read my fingerprint. A tiny laser scanned my retina. The lock clicked open with a heavy, solid sound. This was not a junk car. This was a custom-armored command unit worth $300,000. I slid into the driver's seat. The smell of old mop water still clung to my clothes. It was a smell I had grown used to over the last 3 months. It was the smell of honesty. I pulled off the thick, ugly glasses that hid my face. I wiped the fake grime from my cheeks with a wet wipe. I stared at myself in the rearview mirror. I looked like my father, Marcus Vance. He was the man who built this city. He started Vertex Innovations 40 years ago, in a garage not far from here. He was a genius. But he was also a kind man. He knew every employee by name. He ate lunch in the cafeteria with the interns. He always told me that if I wanted to know the truth about a company, I should not ask the CEO. He said I should ask the people who empty the trash cans. They see everything. They hear everything. They are invisible. When my father died 6 months ago, he left me everything. He left me the controlling stake in Vertex. He left me billions of dollars in assets. But he also left me a warning. He told me that sharks were circling the water. He told me that someone on the inside was rotting the company from the core. He told me to trust no one until I saw their true face. That is why I became Elena the cleaner. And for 90 days I had watched. I had listened. And I had found the rot. His name was Chadwick Sterling. Chadwick was not just a rude executive. He was a corporate parasite. He had been brought in by the board of directors to boost profits before the quarterly review. But Chadwick did not know how to build. He only knew how to cut. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat. I connected to the secure server of the car. I pulled up the dossier on Chadwick. The screen filled with data. It was worse than I thought. I scrolled through the files I had secretly copied from the server room while pretending to dust the vents. Chadwick was systematically firing the senior engineers. He was firing the people who had been with my father for 20 years. He called them expensive dinosaurs. But that was not the worst part. I opened the file marked Project Helios. This was my father's dream. It was a revolutionary medical robot designed to perform heart surgery on children. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be perfect. But the documents on my screen told a different story. Chadwick had secretly changed the suppliers 3 weeks ago. He had fired the German manufacturer known for precision. He had hired a shell company based in an offshore tax haven. This shell company supplied sensors that were 80% cheaper, and they had a failure rate of 12%. My blood ran cold. 12% failure rate in heart surgery meant death. Chadwick was trading the lives of children for a bonus check. He was going to present this project to the investors next week as a triumph of cost-cutting. He was going to boost the stock price. He was going to cash out his options. And then he was going to leave before the lawsuits started. He was going to destroy my father's legacy for a new yacht. My phone buzzed on the console. It was Silas. He spoke quickly. He said that Chadwick had just made a move. He said that after firing me, Chadwick had called security to wipe the camera footage of the conference room. He was covering his tracks. Silas asked me what I wanted to do. I looked up at the towering glass building of Vertex Innovations. The sun was setting, turning the glass into blood-red mirrors. I told Silas to let Chadwick think he had won. I told him to let Chadwick feel safe. I told him that we needed one more thing. I had the financial records. I had the supplier contracts. But I needed the smoking gun. I needed the audio recording of Chadwick admitting he knew about the failure rates. I knew where it was. It was on a private encrypted drive in his office safe. I had seen him put it there last week when he was bragging to his mistress on speakerphone. I needed to get back into that office. But now I was fired. My access card was deactivated. Security would be looking for Elena the cleaner. I closed my laptop with a snap. A cold determination settled in my chest. I started the engine of the armored sedan. It purred with a silent, deadly power. I told Silas that tonight Elena the cleaner was dead. Tonight I would have to be someone else. I would have to break into my own building. And I would have to do it while Chadwick was still there celebrating his victory. The trap was set. The villain was defined. The stakes were life and death. And the hunt was on. It was midnight. The Vertex Tower stood like a black monolith against the city skyline. I was no longer wearing the blue jumpsuit. I was dressed in black tactical gear. I carried a backpack containing a signal jammer and a high-frequency decoder. I did not go to the front entrance. The security guards at the front desk were new. They were hired by Chadwick. They were armed, and they were looking for me. I went to the loading dock at the back of the building. This was where the trash was taken out. I knew this entrance better than anyone. I knew that the biometric scanner on the service door had a glitch. If you pressed the bottom left corner of the screen, it reset the lock for 3 seconds. I had reported this glitch to maintenance 4 times. They never fixed it. Now that incompetence was my key, I pressed the corner of the screen. The light turned green. The heavy steel door clicked open. I slipped inside. The air smelled of stale cardboard and diesel fumes. I moved quickly through the shadows. I avoided the main elevators. They had cameras with facial recognition. Instead, I headed for the service elevator. It was used for hauling heavy equipment and cleaning supplies. I used my old master key card. It still worked on this elevator because Chadwick had forgotten to update the service protocols. The elevator groaned as it started to rise. I watched the numbers climb. 10, 20, 30. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I was breaking into my own building to steal my own property. The elevator stopped at the 40th floor. I could not go higher. The top 2 floors were the executive suites. They were on a separate security grid. I had to walk the rest of the way. I stepped out into the silent hallway. It was dark. Only the emergency exit lights cast a ghostly green glow. I moved to the stairwell. I climbed 2 flights of stairs. My breath was shallow and controlled. I reached the door to the 42nd floor. This was it. The lion's den. I pressed my ear against the heavy fire door. I heard nothing. I used the decoder to bypass the electronic lock. It took 10 agonizing seconds. The light turned green. I pushed the door open and stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive floor. It was silent. But it was not empty. I saw a light coming from the end of the hall. It was Chadwick's office. He was still here. I crept along the wall. I stayed low. I reached the open door of his office and peeked inside. The room was empty. Chadwick must have stepped out to the restroom or the break room. This was my chance. I slipped into the office. It smelled of expensive cigars and arrogance. I went straight to the large painting on the wall behind his desk. It was a modern abstract piece that cost $50,000. I knew what was behind it. I swung the painting aside. There was the wall safe. I pulled out my UV light pen. I shined it on the keypad. Traces of oil from fingerprints glowed on 4 specific numbers. 1, 5, 9, 3. I knew Chadwick. He was a narcissist. He would use a number that meant something to him. I tried the date of his promotion. Nothing. I tried the price of his new car. Nothing. The keypad beeped twice. One more wrong attempt, and the alarm would sound. I closed my eyes. I thought like a cleaner. I remembered cleaning his desk last week. I remembered a framed photo of him shaking hands with a senator. The date on the photo was September 15th, 1993. It was the only photo in the room. 1, 5, 9, 3. I punched in the code. 1, 9, 9, 3. Wait. It was the date of his first million. I remembered him bragging about it on the phone. May 1st, 1993. 0, 5, 1, 9, 9, 3. That was too many digits. I looked at the glowing fingerprints again. 1, 5, 9, 3. I took a deep breath. I typed 1, 5, 9, 3. Click. The heavy steel door of the safe swung open. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Inside there were stacks of cash. There were passports. And there it was. The black encrypted hard drive. I grabbed the drive and shoved it into my pocket. I reached up to close the safe. Suddenly I heard voices in the hallway. They were loud. They were coming closer. I heard Chadwick's voice booming down the corridor. He said he did not care about the cost. He said to just get it done by morning. My blood froze. He was coming back. There was no time to leave. There was no time to close the painting. I looked around frantically. The desk was open underneath. Too risky. The curtains were sheer. The closet. I dove into the coat closet near the door, just as Chadwick walked into the room. I pulled the door shut, leaving a tiny crack. I held my breath. Through the crack I saw Chadwick enter. He was not alone. A second man walked in behind him. I recognized him immediately. It was Lawrence Pike. He was the head of our legal department. He was supposed to be the company's moral compass. But right now he looked like a conspirator. Chadwick walked to his desk. He paused. He looked at the painting on the wall. My heart stopped. I had left the painting slightly crooked. Chadwick stared at it for a long moment. Then he laughed. He told Lawrence to pour him a drink. He did not notice the safe. He was too drunk on his own power. Lawrence poured 2 glasses of scotch. He asked Chadwick if he was worried about the girl. He meant me. He meant Elena the cleaner. Chadwick took a sip of his drink and sat on the edge of his desk. He laughed again. He said that the cleaner was nobody. He said she was just a cockroach. He had squashed. But then Lawrence said something that made my blood run cold. He asked Chadwick about the real problem. He asked about Elena Vance. He asked what would happen when the heiress finally showed up to claim the company. Chadwick smiled a wicked smile. He swirled the ice in his glass. He told Lawrence not to worry about Elena Vance. He said that by the time Elena Vance realized what was happening, it would be too late. He said that tomorrow morning at the board meeting, they were going to blame the failure of Project Helios on her late father. They were going to claim that Marcus Vance had ordered the cheap parts before he died. They were going to frame a dead man. And since Elena was his heir, the lawsuits would bankrupt her personally. Chadwick said he had already forged the emails. He said he had already planted the fake evidence on the server. He said that by noon tomorrow, Elena Vance would be poor and he would own the company. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stop a scream. This was not just theft. This was a coup. They were going to destroy my father's name. They were going to ruin me. And they were going to kill children with faulty robots. I felt the hard drive in my pocket. It was the only thing that could stop them. I had to get out. I had to get this drive to the authorities before the meeting started at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. But then Chadwick stood up. He walked toward the closet. He told Lawrence that he needed to get his coat. He said it was getting chilly. He reached for the handle of the closet door. He was 3 inches away from discovering me. I tensed my muscles. I prepared to fight. I had a taser in my pocket. But against 2 men I would lose. The handle began to turn. Suddenly a loud crash echoed from the hallway. It sounded like a vase shattering. Chadwick froze. He pulled his hand back. He looked at the door. He yelled out to security. He pulled a gun from his desk drawer. Yes. Chadwick Sterling had a gun in his office. He and Lawrence ran out into the hallway to investigate the noise. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I burst out of the closet. I ran to the window. We were on the 42nd floor. There was no balcony. But there was a window washing platform suspended just 1 floor above. I didn't have a choice. I grabbed a heavy bronze statue from the desk. I smashed the window. The glass shattered into a million diamonds against the night sky. The wind roared into the room. I climbed onto the ledge. I looked down. 42 floors of nothing but death. I looked up at the cables of the platform. I jumped. The wind roared in my ears. My fingers clawed at the cold night air. I slammed into the metal grating of the window washing platform. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs. Pain exploded in my shoulder. I grabbed the steel railing just as my feet slipped off the edge. I dangled 400 feet above the concrete. My grip was slipping. My gloves were wet with sweat. I looked up at the broken window. Chadwick was there. He was leaning out into the darkness. He held a silver pistol in his hand. He scanned the ledge below. I held my breath. I hung perfectly still in the shadows. If he looked down just 2 more feet, I was dead. He cursed into the wind. He told Lawrence that I must have fallen. He said that gravity had done their job for them. He pulled his head back inside. The lights in the office went out. I was safe. But I was not done. I pulled myself up onto the platform. I collapsed on the metal floor, gasping for air. I checked my pocket. The hard drive was still there. It was safe. I looked at my watch. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. The board meeting was in 8 hours. I had 8 hours to transform from a fugitive cleaner into the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire. I lowered the platform manually to the ground floor. I limped to my armored car. I drove to a safe house in the hills. I did not sleep. I showered the grime and the fear off my body. I treated the bruises on my ribs. I opened the closet in the safe house. Inside hung a white suit. It was sharp. It was tailored. It was the kind of suit my father wore when he went to war in the boardroom. I put it on. I looked in the mirror. Elena, the cleaner, was gone. Elena Vance had returned. 9 o'clock in the morning. The Vertex boardroom was a cage of glass and steel. 12 board members sat around the mahogany table. They were old men with gray hair and expensive watches. Chadwick stood at the head of the table. He looked fresh. A looked confident. He was projecting a chart onto the wall. The chart showed the projected profits from Project Helios. He was lying. He told the board that the new sensors were a breakthrough. He told them that Marcus Vance had approved the change before he died. He paused for dramatic effect. He lowered his voice. He said it was a shame that Marcus's daughter Elena was not there. He said that poor Elena had suffered a mental breakdown. He said she had disappeared. He suggested that the board should vote immediately to transfer her voting rights to him for the good of the company. The board members nodded. They believed him. They raised their hands to vote. Chadwick smiled. It was the smile of a wolf who had just cornered a lamb. Suddenly, the double doors of the boardroom slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Every head turned. 2 security guards tried to block the doorway. I stepped past them. I walked into the room. My heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor. Click. 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 The sound echoed in the stunned silence. Chadwick's face went pale. His smile vanished. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He stammered. He asked what I was doing there. He told security to remove this intruder. I didn't look at security. I looked straight at the chairman of the board. I spoke clearly. I stated that I was Elena Vance. I stated that I was the majority shareholder of this company. And I stated that nobody was voting on anything until I spoke. Chadwick laughed nervously. He tried to regain control. He told the board that I was unstable. He told them I was just a grief-stricken girl who didn't understand business. He said I had no proof of anything. He said I should go back to spending my daddy's money on shoes. I walked to the head of the table. I stood right next to him. I smelled the fear on him. It smelled like sweat and scotch. I placed the black hard drive on the table. It made a heavy thud. I connected it to the main projector system. Chadwick lunged for the drive. He tried to grab it. But the chairman stood up. The chairman ordered Chadwick to sit down. I pressed play. Chadwick's voice filled the room. It was the recording from last night. The audio was crisp and clear. He said, "Who cares about the failure rate?" He said, "If a few kids die on the operating table, we blame the doctors." He said, "We just need the stock to hit $100 so I can sell my shares." The boardroom went deadly silent. The investors looked at Chadwick with horror. But I wasn't done. I let the recording play to the end. Then I switched to the next file. This was the twist. This was the moment Chadwick did not expect. The screen changed. It showed a video. It was a video taken from a hidden camera. The camera angle was low. It showed Chadwick's shoes. It showed him kicking over a bucket of water. It showed him spitting on a cleaner. It was the footage from my glasses. The footage from Elena the cleaner. I looked at the board. I told them that for 3 months I had been the invisible woman in this building. I told them that I had scrubbed their floors. I had emptied their trash. And I had seen everything. I turned to Chadwick. He was trembling. He was sweating profusely. I leaned in close to his face. I whispered so only he could hear. I asked him if he remembered the cockroach he tried to crush. I told him that the cockroach had survived. Then I turned back to the room. I announced that the police were waiting in the lobby. I announced that the FBI had already received copies of the hard drive. I announced that Project Helios was suspended immediately. Chadwick tried to run. He bolted for the side door. But the door opened before he could reach it. 2 officers in uniform stepped in. They were holding handcuffs. Chadwick screamed. He screamed that he was set up. He screamed that I was a witch. He screamed that he was the vice president. But as they dragged him out of the room kicking and screaming, he didn't look like a vice president. He looked like trash. And for the first time in 3 months, the air in Vertex Innovations felt clean. But the story was not over. I looked at the board members. They were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They were the ones who had hired Chadwick. They were the ones who had ignored the warnings. I tapped the table. I told them not to get too comfortable. I told them that the cleaning was not finished. I told them that I had a second list of names on that hard drive. And I was just getting started. The police took Chadwick away. But the room was still full of his enablers. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table. I looked at the chairman of the board. He was a man named Arthur. He had been my father's friend for 30 years. Yet he had let Chadwick rot this company from the inside. Arthur tried to speak. He cleared his throat. He said that they had no idea. He said they were deceived by Chadwick, just like everyone else. He tried to smile. He said he was glad I was back to take my rightful place. I did not smile back. I picked up the remote control. I clicked to the next slide on the screen. It was an email chain. It was dated 3 months ago. It was an email from Arthur to Chadwick. The email approved the firing of the senior engineering team. It said that cutting costs was more important than loyalty. Arthur's face turned gray. I told him that ignorance was a mistake. But complicity was a choice. I told him that he had chosen his side. I pulled a stack of envelopes from my briefcase. I slid them down the table. 1 for Arthur. 1 for the treasurer. 1 for Lawrence Pike, the lawyer who poured Chadwick's scotch. I told them to open them. They were not severance packages. They were termination notices for cause. I told them that they were fired for breach of fiduciary duty. I told them that my lawyers were already filing civil suits to recover the bonuses they paid themselves last quarter. Arthur stood up. He was shaking. He said I couldn't do this. He said the company would collapse without the board. I looked him in the eye. I told him the company was already collapsing with them. I told security to escort them out. I told them to take the stairs. The room cleared out. For the first time, I was alone in my father's office. But I did not sit in his chair. Not yet. I had work to do. I picked up the phone. I dialed a number in Munich, Germany. I spoke to the CEO of the original supplier for Project Helios. I apologized for the interruption. I offered them a new contract. I offered to pay 20% above the market rate for expedited shipping. They agreed. The dangerous parts from the shell company were thrown into the trash. Then I made the call I had wanted to make for 90 days. I called the head of human resources. I told her to rehire every single engineer that Chadwick had fired. I told her to offer them their old jobs back with a 15% raise and a personal apology letter from me. By the afternoon, the office was buzzing. People were coming back. There were tears. There were hugs. But I had one last stop to make. I took the elevator down to the basement. I went to the janitorial supply room. The team was there. They were getting ready for the night shift. They looked tired. They were surprised to see the CEO walking into their break room in a white suit. They started to stand up out of respect. I waved for them to sit down. I saw Maria. She was the one who had given me half her sandwich when I was hungry last week. I saw John. He was the one who had helped me lift heavy trash bags when my back hurt. I told them that things were changing. I told them that Vertex Innovations was no longer using a third-party cleaning service. I told them that effective immediately, they were all direct employees of the company. That meant full health care. That meant paid time off. That meant their children would be eligible for the company scholarship fund. Maria started to cry. She covered her mouth with her hands. She asked if I was serious. I walked over and hugged her. I told her that the person who cleans the floor is just as important as the person who walks on it. I told them that without them, this tower would just be a dirty glass box. I left the basement with my heart full. But justice has two faces. One is kindness. The other is punishment. 3 months later, I sat in the courtroom. I watched the judge read the verdict. Chadwick Sterling stood in the defendant's box. He looked thin. He looked tired. His arrogance was gone. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment. Chadwick looked back at the gallery. He looked for his friends. He looked for his high society connections. But the benches were empty. Nobody came. Except for me. Our eyes met for 1 second. I didn't smirk. I didn't wave. I just looked at him with absolute indifference. He was no longer a monster. He was just a memory. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight. My phone buzzed. It was a message from the engineering team. Project Helios had just completed its final safety test. Success rate was 100%. The first surgery was scheduled for tomorrow. A little girl with a heart defect was going to live because we did the right thing. I got into my car. I drove past the Vertex Tower. The lights were on. The people were working. My father's legacy was safe. But I had learned something important. I learned that a title does not make a leader. A corner office does not make you powerful. Real power comes from the truth. And sometimes to see the truth you have to get down on your knees and scrub the floor. The storm was over. But the lesson would last forever. I still keep the blue jumpsuit. It hangs in my closet inside a plastic bag. It hangs right next to my $3,000 Italian blazers. Sometimes new executives ask me why I keep it. They ask if it is a souvenir. I tell them no. It is not a souvenir. It is a mirror. It reminds me of the days when I was invisible. It reminds me of the days when people looked through me instead of looking at me. Chadwick Sterling made a fatal mistake. He thought that power was a suit. He thought that dignity was a paycheck. He forgot that the foundation of any skyscraper is buried in the dirt. If you destroy the foundation, the tower falls. Vertex Innovations is different now. We have a new rule. Every new executive must spend 1 week working with the cleaning crew. They must empty the trash. They must scrub the floors. They must learn the names of the people who make their lives comfortable. Some people say it is a waste of time. I tell them it is the most important training they will ever receive. It teaches them humility. It teaches them that respect is not something you demand. Respect is something you earn. I often think about that moment in the conference room. I think about the coffee staining the carpet. I think about the laughter. It would have been easy to hate them. It would have been easy to become bitter. But I chose a different path. I chose to turn my humiliation into fuel. So here is my message to you. Maybe you feel small today. Maybe you have a boss who treats you like a number. Maybe you feel like you are shouting into the void and nobody is listening. Do not let them break you. Do not let them convince you that you are worth less because your bank account is empty. Your value does not come from your title. It comes from your character. It comes from your integrity. It comes from how you treat people when nobody is watching. Keep working. Keep watching. Keep building your strength in the shadows. Because the world is full of Chadwicks. They are loud. They are arrogant. But they are blind. They do not see the storm coming. But you do. You are the storm. And when your moment comes, and it will come, make sure you are ready to step out of the shadows. Make sure you are ready to lead. Not with fear, but with the truth. My name is Elena Vance. I was a cleaner. I am a CEO. But above all, I am a human being. And I will never let anyone forget that again. Be kind to the invisible people. Because you never know. They might just own the building.